Hi everyone, my name is Ms. Babati. I am the research analyst at the Center for International and Regional Studies, CIRS, at Georgetown University. Since its inception, CIRS has been devoted to the academic study of the region and international issues and has invited scholarship and research on the region. We have also engaged in dialogue and exchange of ideas with scholars, researchers, experts, opinion makers, policymakers, government officials, as well as activists. Today, we are very honored to be hosting Professor Mehran Kamrava for a conversation on the recent war between Iran and Israel. For people who know Professor Kamrava, he needs no introduction. He is a renowned scholar when it comes to Iran, Persian studies, IR of the Middle East, as well as the politics of Middle East. However, for our listeners, I am going to briefly outline his bio. Kamrava, or Professor Kamrava, is a professor of government at Georgetown University. He is also the director of Iranian Studies at Arab Institute for Research and Policy Studies. He is our former boss and the founding director of CIRS. He is known for his scholarship and work in the realm of Persian studies, Iran, the Middle East, Qatar, GCC, and the list goes on. He has extensively produced work, including journal articles and books on the topics. His latest book is titled How Islam Rules in Iran, Theology and Theocracy in Islamic Republic. But this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his scholarship. Professor Kamrava, thank you so much for coming and having a conversation with us today.
Thank you, Ms. Ba, and thank you for that warm introduction. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Over the past couple of weeks, I would say the region has experienced some extraordinary events, which has had lasting repercussions, not for the region, but for the globe in general. The latest war between Iran and Israel will have lasting implications. Can you just quickly bring us up to date on what the latest developments have been?
Yes, thank you. You're absolutely right. After 2023, I always thought that 2023 will become known in history as another highlight in Middle East history, similar to 1948, the creation of Israel, 1956, the Suez Canal crisis, 1967, the Arab-Israeli War, 1973. And I thought the genocide that followed October 7, 2023 would be known and would be a defining period in Middle East history. Yes, indeed, it will become a defining period in Middle Eastern history. We haven't had a genocide of this magnitude in recent history in the Middle East. But I think also 2025, the Iran-Israel war, what the Americans are now calling the 12-day war, will also become one of those major highlights. What we have is a series of unprecedented developments whereby Israel attacked Iran, which was unprecedented, although we anticipated it, but nobody thought it would actually happen or it would happen the way it unfolded. Then we have the unprecedented development of Iran retaliating. And by all accounts, even by Donald Trump's account, Iran really was able to inflict devastating blows to Israel. And then, of course, also unprecedented was the American bombing of Iran, the fact that the United States attacked Iran's nuclear facilities in 3 key locations, in Natanz, in Esfahan, and at Fardo. So by all accounts, we are in the midst of a series of historic developments that are bound to have long-term consequences for the region, for each of the countries involved, and for the world at large.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was a really comprehensive summary and gives us quite a bit of understanding of where we stand as of today. To start off my questions, I want to pose a more broader inquiry to you, and this is in regards to the regional security and the region being the GCC and the wider Middle East. Do you think, in your expert opinion, that this particular war has had a critical impact on the regional security dynamics? And do you think, in terms of the strategic thinking of the GCC in particular, they have changed their stance when it comes to the United States? And I want to particularly pose this point because when, as you mentioned, the United States launched its strike in the 3 nuclear sites, we saw a very dynamic shift to what we observed in terms of their reaction in 2019 and early 2020 when Donald Trump was first in office. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's absolutely right. I should have also mentioned unprecedented was the fact that Iran attacked an American base in Qatar. And that, of course, is a fear, the worst fear that the GCC states have had came true with Iran attacking an American base. And that, of course, is quite important. In terms of the answer to your question, it's still early days. We still have to digest and to see really what are the long-term consequences of Iran's attack on Al Udeid. Every time you invite an American base, you also invite negative attention of the sort that Qatar received just less than a week ago. Mm-hmm. And so this really brings to light the dilemma that these states have in terms of their security independence, the fact that they have to rely on the United States for providing them with security, while at the same time, they then become unwitting participants in any clash between the United States and Iran. And this is, from an IR perspective, this is a classic problem with so-called bandwagoning. Every time you bandwagon with a bigger power, what happens, one of the potential consequences is entrapment. You can become trapped in your patron's war with their adversary. And this is precisely what happened. If the United States and Iran really get into a military conflict, Iran is unable, and even if it were able, unlikely to hit Kansas or Kentucky. They would hit Al Udeid, they would hit U.S. bases across the region. And so, those host countries find themselves at a particularly vulnerable position. We have yet to see how the GCC would react. This appears to have been, by all accounts, a one-off. In the same way when Iran, following the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani by the first Trump administration, hit American bases in Iraq. And similar scenario unfolded then. First, the Iranians informed the Iraqis, then the Iraqis in turn informed the Americans, the Iranians hit, and it was all over. And the Iraqi government protested, and then it was business as usual. And we have the same scenario unfold here. The Iranian government informed Qatar, which in turn informed the United States. U.S. moved its personnel and military material out of the base, and the Iranians hit. And then the Iranian president called the Emir of Qatar, and the Iranian foreign minister called the Qatari foreign minister. And by all accounts, they kissed and made up. And things are back to normal.
Things are back to normal. We see a ceasefire has been proposed, accepted by both parties, and it's business as usual, as you said. But the question of the increased arms race is still there. It's very pertinent. It's concerning. And do you think this conflict has added more wood to that fire and opened up maybe opportunities for Russia and China to be more involved and have more prominent roles?
First of all, although there is a ceasefire in place, if you look at Israeli behavior in the past, they have repeatedly violated the ceasefire with Lebanon. And Israelis have found one pretext or another to attack Lebanon, and they're attacking Lebanon at will. So if you talk to people in Iran, they actually quite anticipate that Israel would break the ceasefire and that it would do it at will. It could find a pretext, some sort of an excuse to break this ceasefire. So although there's a ceasefire in place between Iran and Israel, it continues to remain extremely fragile. And it's not certain by any stretch of imagination that it would hold in the long term. So that's one thing to keep in mind. In terms of the regional arms race, every year we hear that that the GCC states have set a new record in terms of their arms purchases. First and foremost from the United States, but also from a number of other arms suppliers. For example, we see that the Qataris have purchased a lot of naval equipment from Italy. The Emiratis want to purchase advanced fighter jets from France, in addition to the United States. And when the American president was in the region, and even before that, we heard billions of dollars worth of purchases by the GCC states of American arms and other kinds of investment, not just arms. So a regional arms race has already been in place, and I anticipate, as you mentioned, that it would only be intensified following the Iranian attack on Al Udeid base.
Which is very concerning. And I appreciate you mentioning the deal with Italy. It's not just purchasing of equipment, but it's also training programs, right? They send every year, I think, 2 to 3 batches of naval officers to be trained in Italy for at least 2 years programming. So I think that is part of the conversation that is going on. Continuing on the regional security, I want to draw your attention towards the energy infrastructure. And how do you think that this particular conflict puts that in jeopardy when it comes to shipping lanes, pipelines, both in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea? Strait of Hormuz has been the point of discussion for the past couple of weeks. What are your thoughts?
Theoretically, the Iranians could hit oil installations across the region, across the Arabian Peninsula. Theoretically, they could disrupt shipping in the Persian Gulf by closing the Strait of Hormuz. Theoretically, they could hit ships going in and out of the Persian Gulf. Theoretically, they could do all of that. But that is only in theory. In practice, it is extremely doubtful if the Iranians did any of it, at least under the current circumstances. Although in 2019, they hit Aramco, Saudi Aramco, in Abqaiq. The Abqaiq attacks really disrupted the flow of oil temporarily out of the region. But for Iran, that would be equivalent to the so-called nuclear option. And at the same time, they would significantly hurt their own commercial interests. Insurance rates are going to go up. So a lot of Iranian trade in and out of Iranian ports goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And I sincerely doubt if the Iranians would jeopardize oil installations in any of the neighboring countries or jeopardize shipping in and out of the Persian Gulf. And incidentally, let's also remember that although they could hit oil installations, then what they're doing is they're signaling that oil installations are fair game. And their own oil installations then are in jeopardy.
That is an interesting take. Thank you very much for sharing that. I want to move our conversation more towards Qatar and the mediation effort involved. And even though the ceasefire was announced by the U.S. President Donald Trump, as you indicated in our initial start of the conversation, it was the Qataris that stepped in and actually made the negotiations possible and played a huge role in the mediation. Do you think this has been a diplomatic victory for Qatar? And if so, has it increased its standing regionally?
Absolutely. As you know, mediation is a pillar of Qatari foreign policy. It's an actual dimension of Qatari foreign policy, of which Qatari policymakers are quite proud and openly talk about. And probably this is one of the most critical of the mediations that Qatar did. As we heard the American president say, what happened was Donald Trump called the Emir of Qatar. The Emir of Qatar in turn got in touch with the Iranian leadership and convinced them to accept a ceasefire agreement, which Donald Trump had already gotten the Israelis to agree to. But for Qatar, it's been a double-edged sword because Iran had to hit an American military base following the U.S. attack on Iran. Politically, Iran could not afford not to have hit an American base because of the domestic political repercussions. And for Qatar, which is a small state, for Qatar, which is security dependent on the United States, there can be political costs. And as a result, we saw a strong Qatari reaction. Not only was the Iranian ambassador called to the foreign ministry, but also Qatar issued a very strong statement condemning the attack and the violation of its sovereignty. GCC foreign ministers met in Doha following the attack. The president of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, came to Qatar and expressed solidarity and fraternity, which has its own irony, but that's besides the point. But so it was, in some ways, it is a diplomatic victory, but also Qatar has its own domestic audience. The Qatari state has its own domestic audience that it needs to placate and reassure that we're not as vulnerable as we seem.
Thank you very much. I want to continue on the topic of mediation, but through the lens of the U.S. this time. Do you think because of the U.S.'s attack on the Iranian nuclear sites in the middle of negotiations has jeopardized that credibility of negotiator and mediator, particularly because this is in violation of the Hague Resolution of 1907, which I believe Japan was held accountable for when it attacked Pearl Harbor? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. First of all, as you know, Iran's negotiations with the United States were ongoing, and Israel attacked, and that caused negotiations to be derailed. Then, over the course of Israeli attack, we have the American president that comes out and says, eventually, he says, this was a partnership like no other in history. I think that's an almost exact quote, a partnership like no other in history. And so there's a current of thought in Iran that says that the negotiations between Iran and the United States were simply a ruse by the US and Israel to lull Iranians into a sense of complacence so that Israel could attack. Now, following the cessation of hostilities and the ceasefire agreement, the Americans have announced that there will be negotiations next week between Iran and the United States. The Iranians, as of this morning, had yet to announce whether or not there is a negotiation indeed, which has been a pattern that they've repeated in the past. The Americans have said there are negotiations, and there have been negotiations. So this could be simply a reflection of Iran's modus operandi, or their just unwillingness, or they see no need to announce that there are negotiations. But we have to wait and see over the course of the next couple of days what happens. Because yesterday at the NATO summit, President Trump announced that Iran and the United States will meet, quote, next week. And we have to wait and see if that meeting indeed takes place. If it does, is it once again under the auspices of the good offices of Oman, Is it in Muscat, or is it at the residence of the Omani ambassador to Rome? Is it with Iranian foreign minister and Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy? Is it at a different level of diplomatic representation? We have to wait and see.
I want to continue on that strand and dig deeper into your own work on Iran and particularly Iran's nuclear program. But starting off with your own work, your recent publications have been very much focused on the Islamic Republic when it comes to either righteous politics or the Sacred Republic. You sort of understand, or you have your finger on the pulse of how, I guess, different institutions in Iran are thinking, or their the working model that they operate on. In the light of this current war, conflict, whatever we want to call it, what do the domestic institutions in Iran look like, and how do their interpretation of this crisis shape their external standing globally?
Well, first, I appreciate that vote of confidence, but I have to caution that usually predicting the behavior of institutions is a hazardous endeavor, and predicting the behavior of Iranian institutions is particularly difficult, and they can be notoriously unpredictable. So it's very difficult. And again, we have to wait and see how the Iranian state emerges out of this war with Israel and what it tries to do. Will it constrict political space even more because it worries that if it gives up a little, then it's opening a Pandora's box that it cannot contain? Or will it try to reinvigorate or win once again a measure and a semblance of popular legitimacy among the population by easing up some social restrictions, by having the so-called reformists have more power and influence within the political system? And we particularly have to wait and see what is the behavior of the security apparatus in Iran, not just the Revolutionary Guards and the volunteer force known as the Basij, but also city police. And city police, of course, have their own regular functions, which is directing traffic, fighting crime, and all that. But then they also, at times, broaden the scope of their functions by imposing public morality. And that imposition of public morality tends to be extremely unpopular particularly with the middle and upper classes in Iranian cities. And so we have to wait and see, for example, how the city polices in Tehran, Esfahan, Shiraz, and other cities behave, and whether or not they enforce hijab restrictions or they look the other way. What is the domestic institutional profile of the Revolutionary Guards, and what announcements will the so-called Supreme Leader make? Supreme Leader has been in a bunker since the start of the conflict. And again, as of a couple of hours ago, he hadn't been heard from by any Iranian, in fact. And people were asking, where is he and what's happened to him and why is he so quiet? And apparently he's in hiding because of credible threat of assassination against him. So we have to wait and see how Iran's domestic politics pans out and how the body politic as a whole reacts to these developments. I think also important is to see how the public reacts to all of this development. There was an initial sense of shock and anger when Israel attacked, followed by intense pride at Iran's retaliatory measures, followed by a sense of resignation as the war entered into its third, fourth, and fifth day. And as Donald Trump tweeted that people should leave Tehran, a lot of people did. And so now that the shock and anger is over, will that sense of resignation among the general population continue? Or will it turn into demands for political accountability? A lot of people are beginning to say, look, you spend millions on proxy groups in Lebanon and elsewhere. Where were they when we were getting bombed? A lot of people are saying, why was the Revolutionary Guards so woefully incompetent in protecting itself and in protecting Iran? They got decapitated in the first few days of the conflict by Israel, and then Tehran was bombed to the extent that American president came out and said, we, not Israel, we are in control of Iranian skies. And then he demanded what he called total, complete capitulation. So I think over the next month or so, that's a space for us to watch and see if the Iranian public demands greater accountability from the political leadership, or if it will simply go back to business as usual and become conformist and compliant because they are worried about sanctions evasion, they're worried about declining purchasing power, declining living standards, and kind of preoccupied with daily life.
I appreciate you mentioning this because my next question is very much tied into this in terms of what comes next, what would be the demands. And this is more in regards to what the thinking in Tehran is now, as well as what the strategic planning would be when it comes to the nuclear program. Because as we've seen, or as a result of this current war, we have observed that the peaceful nuclear program is not working in Iran's favor, right? It has attracted a military action rather than deterred it. And I think Iran is in no position to overtly go out and say, we are pursuing this nuclear program. So what is the thinking in Tehran right now? And would the people, the public of Iran support it?
Another excellent question. First of all, I think as we've been talking, there are several different areas to watch. And I'll start with Iran's security posture. Some time ago, long before this war started, it became apparent to the Iranian leadership that they needed to change their deterrence strategy, that having proxy groups, putting together the so-called axis of resistance worked, and it did work for a number of years. But then after 2023, and once Israel attacked Lebanon in 2024, that axis was destroyed. And that became painfully obvious, if it hadn't already been obvious, when Israel attacked Iran. The axis of resistance was not a factor by any stretch of imagination. And so even before the war, I suspect there had been serious conversations in Iran as to what deterrence posture to adopt now vis-a-vis Israel and vis-a-vis the United States. And so that's one lesson, kind of an overall shift in Iran's deterrence strategy. What we did see in this conflict was that this conflict reinforced the lesson that the Iranians had acquired after the war with Iraq was over in 1988. And after that war, Iran discovered that it needed to put together a missile defense program. And we saw that to a large extent, that deterrent strategy worked in this conflict because Tel Aviv, Beersheba, Haifa, they were hit. And although Iran was itself hit and more than 600 Iranians were killed, nonetheless, Iran was able to inflict serious damages on Israel and gave Israel a bloody nose. So, if anything, the missile program is going to be expanded and enhanced, and it's definitely now off the table. Now, the question that you asked, I think, goes to the heart of what Iran is thinking: what to do with the nuclear program, and should Iran finally weaponize its nuclear program? What should happen? And I don't know if a decision has yet been made. Of course, official rhetoric is that the nuclear sites received minimal damage, that maybe they were set back by a few months, but not much is going to happen. And I think that's something for us to watch, either for the rest of the duration of the Trump presidency, or maybe the Iranians would start after Trump leaves office, or will they be even more covert? As you know, there's been a resolution passed by the Iranian parliament to suspend cooperation with the IAEA. Iran has already lodged an official complaint against the Director General of IAEA, Rafael Grossi, and has asked for him to be removed because they said his report paved the groundwork for Donald Trump to attack Iran. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but certainly he is no al-Baradei, who was one of the previous director generals of the IAEA, who said that Iran does not have a nuclear program. So I wonder, there's also, and I wonder to what extent will anti-enrichment voices inside the country be empowered now. Because one thing about enrichment is, for a civilian nuclear program, you don't need enrichment. The only reason you need enrichment is if you want to weaponize. But the Iranians, on the one hand, use enrichment or engage in enrichment now up to 60%, while on the other hand, they insist that their nuclear program is only for peaceful purposes, which is kind of a contradiction. And so the question is it worth having an enrichment program at all? The problem or the fact is that Iran has made the entire discourse of enrichment tied to national pride. And so that's an extremely hard ladder to climb down from, because now they've kind of backed themselves into a corner saying zero enrichment is off the table. That's a red line. We have to enrich. And is it worth the costs? And I'm not sure to what extent that narrative is finding space and expression inside the halls of power in Tehran.
Continuing on the conversation of nuclear sites, hitting nuclear sites is a clear violation of international law, both by the US and Israel. Do you think this particular action has normalized a military action towards nuclear sites, and you'll see more of those in the future?
Well, first of all, let me just say that for the last several years, we've seen that international law has become absolutely irrelevant. We're in the second year of a full-blown genocide with 50 some odd thousand people having been killed, all at the time when those so-called powers that claim to uphold human rights, like Germany, behave as if Palestinians are subhuman. And so I think it's absolutely irrelevant in the current context to still talk about upholding international law by someone like the United States or the European Union or anyone else for that matter. We have, unfortunately, re-entered an era when might makes right. And this is not something that the so-called uncivilized global South has done. It's something that the defenders of human rights have done. And probably at some point historically, they have to be held accountable for this. Countries like Germany, Britain, United States, everyone who has had any sort of complicity with the unfolding of the genocide. Now, going to your question about the attack on nuclear facilities. Again, we are at an era where the United States feels that it has the right and the responsibility to do as it sees fit, and nobody else has that right. So it's openly known, for example, that Israel, which is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has nuclear weapons. Iran cannot even have an enrichment program, which is a signatory to the NPT. So, does it normalize attacks on nuclear facilities? If the Israelis hit Bushehr nuclear facility, all of us will have to, this entire space, this side of the Persian Gulf becomes a wasteland. Not just Iran's southern coast, but this side will also become a wasteland. So one hopes and anticipates that this was a one-off work of a unpredictable and often irrational U.S. president, and that this is not normal state behavior.
Quoting you, might makes right. In order to become more mightier, so to say, do you think the regimes in the region would pursue nuclear proliferation and try to become more mighty in that sense? Are we seeing an onset of more nuclear programs?
Yeah. First, if I may have a minor correction to the use of the word regime, because every time we don't like a political system, we describe it as a regime, whereas what we have in Washington, London, Paris, those are just as much of regimes as we have anywhere else. So you'll forgive me for that minor correction. Would the states of the region pursue nuclear proliferation? Saudi Arabia has already openly declared that if Iran were to have a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia would be next. I think it's a bigger debate as to whether or not the structure of the international community is fundamentally unfair or fair, whereby you have some countries that have nuclear weapons and some that do not. I think it's a fair question to ponder as to whether or not, if Iran had nuclear weapons, would Israel have attacked Iran? And it's much more complicated than that simplistic logic that I just presented, because not only is it a question of having a nuclear weapon, but it is also a question of being able to have a delivery system, a way to safely deliver that nuclear weapon out of your own territory and to hit the adversary if need be. So it's not as easy as just having a nuclear weapon. You also have to have a delivery system. And as we saw in America's attack on Iran, having a nuclear weapon also attracts its own hazards. And so it goes beyond just a simple weapon. And I think policymakers, whether they're sitting in Tehran or in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or anywhere else, are keenly aware of these complexities. So it's not just simply going and buying something off the shelf. But I think certainly we could be staring into the abyss if one country goes nuclear and others try and follow suit.
It's a question that is on everyone's mind and remains unclear, but hopefully we hope for the best. I'm very conscious of our time. I want to continue having this conversation. It's been very enlightening. I'm learning so much. But I definitely want to end with something which is more broader. And as scholars, we're very aware to not have a speculative question. We are very much grounded in our research and realities. And you hinted at this in the beginning of our conversation. What is the future of the ceasefire? Will it hold? What are the next steps? What is Tehran thinking? What is the United States thinking? What is the region thinking?
I think a lot of it would depend on Iranian diplomacy. If the Iranians begin talking with Donald Trump's administration, I think they could strengthen their hand and to ensure that Israel does not violate the ceasefire. You remember that Donald Trump was quite adamant. He, in fact, used expletives and a foul language when he demanded that the two sides observe the ceasefire. And if you listen carefully, he's really talking to Israel. He said, pull back your planes, don't unload your bombs. And that happened. So I think a lot of it depends on what happens over the next week or so. The Israelis have been known in the past to have provoked violations of ceasefire. They have, for example, attacked some American bases, or I believe it was in one of the wars with the Arabs, where they attacked an American ship and blamed it on Egypt. So it's not beyond the pale to see the Israelis do that. But for the time being, the ceasefire is holding. I'm not as pessimistic that the ceasefire would necessarily break down, but I think we all need to have a measure of sobriety and realism in knowing that the ceasefire is fragile, that there are Iranian military commanders as well as Israeli military commanders for whom the war has not ended.
I would like to thank you very much for this enlightening conversation. As I mentioned, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I always learn a lot as a scholar, as a student of IR, and hopefully we can bring you back for a bigger, larger conversation once our classes resume. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, Misbah. It's been an absolute pleasure. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I hope we can reconvene and resume our conversation under happier circumstances.
Inshallah. And with that, we conclude this conversation. For the full interview with Professor Kamrava and more on our research, please visit our website, cirs.georgetown.edu. With that, I would like to thank all our listeners for chiming in today. Thank you very much.